Hi, everyone. Thank you again for tuning in today's webinar. My name is Joseline Nicholas. I am a local real estate agent and real estate investor. I sell a lot of homes in the Kitchener, Waterloo, Guelph, and Hamilton area. I started in real estate as an investor, just buying properties and investing while I kept my full-time job. But there's a time that came that I felt that it was time to leave my employment and start working in full-time in real estate full time. So that's what I do right now. I'm very excited to be here tonight sharing what I've learned in the last 8 years of investing in real estate. So before we get started, just a few things. One, I wanted to let you know that you can post questions in the chat box or in the question box, and I will get to them at the end of this webinar. I also have questions that came through because we sent out questionnaire and some people submitted questions ahead of time, so I will cover those as well. And then I'll just be able to give examples of what I've seen in the last few years just selling tenanted properties. Just one thing that I wanted to say to everyone is that this is obviously not legal advice because I am not a lawyer, I'm not a paralegal. I'm just a real estate investor and an agent, and I'm sharing my insights on what I see works and what we've done or what I do as I'm selling tenanted properties to make sure that we can still net more without causing so much damage in the life or relationship of the tenant and the landlord. So that's basically what I'm going to be talking about. But for very specific situations, you might have to consult with a lawyer or paralegal to make sure that what you're doing is per their advice. So that's another thing. Thirdly, I just wanted to let you know that if you'd like to book a one-on-one consultation to dive deeper into what might be going on in your situation, I am happy to do that. I will put a link in the chat box and feel free to book a consultation with me to look deeper into what's happening and what I would do if I was in your situation. And usually, like when we meet one-on-one, we get a higher result because then I can look at your situation and tell you what I'll do if I was in your situation. Or if you'd like to connect with a lawyer, paralegal, or any other professionals who work in real estate, do let me know because I do have connections here in Southern Ontario and I'm able to help with that as well. So that being said, I'm just gonna get started. As I said, my name is Joseline Nicholas. I'm a realtor and full-time investor. We started buying properties in 2014. And since then, we've bought quite a few properties actually. And we have properties in Kitchener-Waterloo. We have properties in Guelph, Ontario. We have properties in Hamilton as well as Niagara. And sometimes we sell, sometimes we hold on to them. My favorite strategy so far, it's been the bar strategy, where you buy a property that needs a lot of renovations and you renovate it and you rent it out. So you keep it in your portfolio for a few years or as long as you'd like. And then when you feel it's time to advance, you can sell and buy something bigger. But right now, my husband and I, we're focused on growing our portfolio. So we basically renovate and hold the properties for quite some time. As you can see here, my superpower is in finding off-market properties. That is basically what I specialize in. So a lot of clients who buy with me, a lot of the times they are buying things that are not even on the market. So that's basically my superpower. So tonight we will be covering some of the tenant rights and responsibilities in Ontario, especially as it relates to selling properties in Ontario. And I'll be talking about the landlord rights and responsibilities in Ontario, practical advice and examples from my own experience, as well as a checklist for selling a tenanted property. Now, if you want a complete checklist, please let us know because this is a much bigger document that I could not fit in the slides. But what I'll do is towards the end, I will give some of the things that you should start thinking about if you're thinking to sell your investment property. And if you'd like that document that I told you about, the checklist of everything to do, let us know and we'll provide that to you. So some of the tenant rights and responsibilities here in Ontario are, the first one is if a tenant is on a lease, they have the right to stay in the property until the end of the lease. So there's nothing you can do about that unless you negotiate with them and you mutually agree to end the lease. You cannot ask them to leave even if the buyer wants to move into the property. So they're on lease, they have the right to occupy the property until the end of the lease. Secondly, we need 24-hour notice for accessing the property. So that will impact you as a seller or any other person who wants to go through the property, be it a contractor, photography, or even stager, anybody who wants to go through the property, they have to give 24 hours written notice to the tenants. Thirdly, if the tenant is on a month-to-month lease and the buyer wants to move into the property, you will need a minimum of 60 days notice for the tenant to vacate the property. So when you're planning as to timelines or the things to consider when selling this property, just keep in mind that your closing day has to allow for that 60 days notice. And when I say 60 days notice, it's not just 60 calendar days, it's actually 2 full months. So for example, right now, I think we're in mid-October. If I buy a property right now that's tenanted and I want the tenant out, if I'm moving into it, I have to allow 2 full months, which means it's the whole month of November and the whole month of December, which means we can take possession in January. Another thing is the landlord cannot interfere with the tenant's reasonable enjoyment of the rental unit. So that means that, if you're doing, this is kind of very gray, but what this means really is that you cannot interfere with enjoyment of a rental unit. If there's maintenance to be done, you have to keep up with the maintenance until the tenant. So you cannot basically interfere with the tenant's enjoyment of a rental property. Another thing that I wanted to add here is that showings are allowed from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. So anytime within that window, you can show the property, but anything, if you want to do showings at night, midnight, then the tenant is sleeping. So that interferes with the reasonable enjoyment of the rental property. Tenant's responsibility, they have to continue paying rent as agreed upon. And they have to, even if the property is for rent, they have to make sure that they continue to pay rent. They have to maintain the property in a reasonable, clean environment. That also is great because the standard for what a clean environment is, it could vary from person to person. But what I've seen in the past is if it usually just takes the lawyers proving that the place is not up to a standard. For example, things like clutter and just like there's like a lot of mess such that nobody can go into the property or go out. Or if, let's say, if it's not clean such that it impacts other tenants who live in a building, or if it's a duplex in the whole property, then that could be a problem. But otherwise, this also is a gray one that's really hard to prove in court because the cleanliness standard varies from person to person. The responsibility also is to provide proper access to the property with proper notice. So if you give them 24-hour notice, they cannot stop you from going into the property. Legally, they have to allow you to go through the property. Some of the landlord rights, if you decided that you wanted to sell your property, even though it's tenanted, you have the right to do so. And you have the right to make repairs. For example, if something is falling apart and you wanted to make some renovations to basically maintain the property, you have the right to do that, even though it's tenanted. And you also have the right to enter the property with proper notice. I must say here that there are more rights and responsibilities, and you can find them on the Landlord and Tenant Board of Ontario. Just Google that, their website should come up, and you can go into details and read more about these rights and responsibilities in detail. But I just wanted to select a few that are related to the process of selling and buying a home in Ontario. So one of the landlord's responsibilities, obviously, is to abide by the rules and regulations set by the LTB. So in terms of practical advice when it comes to selling a property, I will just share some examples of my own experience buying and selling properties, both as an investor and as a realtor. So the first thing is when you're selling an investment property, you have to decide, will you sell it with the tenant in? So basically, will the new buyer assume the tenant, or are you able to provide vacant possession? So providing vacant possession means that you will sell it without a tenant. So the tenant has to move out and then you can sell it. In either case, there's a few things to consider. So one of the things you have to consider is if you decide to sell it with the tenant, which means the buyer is assuming the tenant, this will reduce the pool of buyers to investors only, which means people who want to buy it to move in cannot do that because the tenant still needs a place to live. Number two, if you buy a property expecting the buyer to assume the tenant, this may result in a reduced sale price because first of all, you're exposing it to a reduced pool of buyers. And second of all, depending on the situation, it may mean that maybe the tenants are paying, let's say, reduced rents, like lower than market rent. So that if an investor is buying it, they will take that into their calculation. The best way to determine what the best course of action is to look at the situation, speak to the tenant, and see if there's a way that you could get a win-win situation. And it also depends on whether or not the tenant is on a lease. As I said before, if the tenant is on a lease, they have to stay in the property until the end of their lease. One of my experiences, I saw the property in January and the tenant was on a lease until September. So I know that my client really wanted to sell. They were in a situation where they had to just sell. They couldn't take care of their property. They were away out of the country, so they just wanted to sell. The buyer, on the other hand, they didn't want to assume the tenant because they wanted to move into the property. So what ended up happening, we still sold the property, but the buyer was willing to wait until September to move in. So they couldn't assume the tenant, but they waited until the tenant moved out at the end of their lease, and they were able to take possession of the property with proper notice, and now they live there. Another situation that I've had clients who bought a property that was already tenanted. So the buyer assumes the tenant. In that case, it was a group of students from the University of Guelph. They had a 2-year lease. My client bought it and they kept the tenant there because they couldn't, like, if you buy it, they weren't planning to move in or anything. It was just going to be an investment property. So now they assume the tenants have a 2-year lease. They're going to live there for the next 2 years. Another situation, as I was saying, is to provide vacant possession. So if you're providing vacant possession of the property, there's a few things that we have to consider. First of all is, how are you going to get vacant possession? There's 2 ways to get vacant possession. One way is through an N11. If you would like a copy of these forms, let me know. I can send them to you and I can explain how they work. Obviously, as I said, if you'd like more tailored advice, reach out to me and I might have to connect you with a lawyer or a paralegal who can help with these forms. But I have used these forms myself on my tenants or my client tenants, or if I'm looking to buy a property that I intend to move into. So you can either do an N11 or you can do an N12. With the N11, this is where the tenant and the landlord are mutually agreeing to end the lease, right? This is also called cash for keys. And in this situation, cooperation is key. Like, both parties have to agree to end the lease. There's also an N12, which is this is where you serve notice to end the tenancy. So before you serve this is basically like, there's no agreement in this case. It's the landlord who tells the tenant that I'd like you to move out. However, you can't just evict someone simply because you're selling. Legally, you can't do that. You're not allowed to do that. So basically, you have to look at a few different things. First of all, you have to look at when the lease ends. If the tenant is on a lease, or I've seen other leases actually where the lease ends, but in the lease, there's an option to extend the lease. In that case, you cannot ask the tenant to move out. You have to wait until the end of the lease. And if they have an option to extend, they can choose to extend, and you have to wait until that second extension is up before you can ask them to leave. And so if the lease agreement allows, you also have to give them 60 days notice, and it has to be done properly. One thing I will mention is, if you are found to be doing this in bad faith, you can be sued, and the fine is up to $50,000. So don't do it. I believe, for me, that the best way to get the N12 served, like, for example, if I'm listing a property and the buyer wants to move in, there's a few things that I'll do. First of all, I want them to sign an affidavit that they're moving in. Because if you end up in court, if they end up buying it and they rent it out to somebody else, and the tenant finds out and they sue, the seller is also going to be on the hook for this. So court one way to avoid like going to court and to clear any misunderstandings is to get the buyer to sign an affidavit that says we intend to move into this property, or our daughter intends to move into this property. Once you have a signed affidavit, then you can issue 60 days notice to the tenant for them to vacate the property for the buyer's occupancy. And the buyer has to agree to move into the property, and they have to stay in the property for at least 1 year before they can rent it out. I think we have a few questions. In my experience, a lot of the times, if people do things that they shouldn't do, like if you do something in bad faith, something like someone will find out. So just don't do it. I find the best way, if let's say the buyer, sometimes I've sold properties where the buyer admits that I just want to rent this property out. In that case, if they're that honest, then you find a way to get an N1 signed by an N11 signed by both parties. And usually cash for keys, I see a lot with investors. And what this means is you literally pay the tenant to move out. How much money you pay them is negotiable. I've seen a situation where they pay 5,000 or they pay 1,000. They pay like just negotiable between the landlord and the tenant. And in some situation, I have had to help tenants find a place and then in addition pay them however much money we agreed upon. If you're going to do cash for keys, my recommendation is to always get the form signed by both parties, making sure that both parties are happy. And in this case is cooperation. I keep saying this like this, even if you know that you have more power, you have ways of getting it done without cooperating with the tenant. I always find that when you cooperate with people, everything turns out better for both parties. So get the N11 signed, and I always put an addendum or what I would call a schedule, like a schedule. Like I always put an attachment to the N11 that says the landlord agrees to pay the tenant this sum or like this much money by this date if the tenant moves out. So I never ever pay unless they move out, because I've seen situations where the landlord will sign something with actually I've seen situations where the landlord negotiates with the tenant agrees to move out if they pay them 5,000, and the landlord goes ahead and pays this guy 5,000 without the tenant even signing the N11. So if they haven't signed and you give them this money, you'd have to fight to get that money back, and in most cases it just costs more money and causes more trouble. So the key is make sure that I feel like the formula in my experience should be get them to sign, get them to move out, and then pay them. Sometimes they might say, oh, I need to use this money that you're paying me for the first and last month rent at the other place that I'm going. That is fine. So at least I just make sure that they sign, because once they sign and they agree that we're mutually agreeing to end the tenancy, if they stay at the end of the agreed upon time, say if you say he's going to move out in 30 days, what I will do is on the 31st day, if they're still there, you can go and file for eviction and they will get it, like it will be granted quicker than if you didn't have the N11 signed. Another situation that I see is where somebody signs and then they change their mind after. Now, in that situation, we already have a signed agreement, so there's nothing that can be done in that situation because they already signed. Another thing I would say about the N11 is if you were to speak to the tenant and you find that there's room that they want to sign an N11, in most cases you might have to think, should I get it signed after the tenant, like after we sell the property, or do you just get the N11 signed, maybe even give them slightly more money to incentivize them to move out sooner, and then list the property? Because if you list a vacant property, you're able to list it and expose it to a wider range or a wider pool of buyers, hence netting more. Also, if the property is vacant, then you have more control as to when you can show the property, who can buy it, when you can close. There's just much more flexibility. So a lot of the times when I speak to a tenant and I see that there's room or there's flexibility and they're willing to sign an N11, I personally will wait until they move out and then list the property, because that gives me more control. Next, if you're thinking to sell a tenanted property, these are the things that I'd be thinking about. First of all, you have to think about the timeline. When would you like to sell it and why, right? With the timeline also comes questions about, for example, I wanted to sell a property this year, but when I look at my income this year, I know that my capital gain will be much higher if I sell that property this year. However, if I sell it next year, maybe I can work around and maybe not have so much income, or maybe I don't know, but I know for sure that if I sell a property this year, my capital gain payment will be much higher than if I wait and sell it next year, because maybe next year I might not have that much high income. So it's just different things that go into whether you should sell now or whether you should wait an additional 60 days. I know when it comes to capital gain, that's one question that a lot of people have been asking me, but I feel that I am not qualified to give capital gain advice. So what I'll do is at a later time, I will get an accountant who can come and speak about capital gain and how that all works. I know one thing I know for sure is that 50% of your return on investment or 50% of your profit is added to your income, and that is how you pay capital gain. I can explain it if somebody wants me to explain more, I could do that, but I just try to stay away from going into accounting concepts because they're very, very specific to individual situations. But when it comes to the timeline, just so many things will go into the decision. Things like, is the tenant on a lease? When I sell, what am I going to do with the money? Because I've seen some people who sell the property and they have the money sitting in their bank account for another year. The property would have appreciated, so your return on investment is higher if you wait and just keep the property, sell it when you're ready. So decide on your timeline, because once you decide on your timeline, that would determine everything else. If you're thinking to sell in the next 12 months, then for sure do not sign new leases, because if you have new leases, again, that would just limit the buyer pool. If you have a lease in place, that means that somebody who wants to move into the property would have to wait until the lease is up. And that is a limitation, therefore decreasing the likelihood that you'll get top dollar for your property. Another thing that I like to do when I'm thinking to sell a property is to inspect the property to assess the condition. There's a lot of very good tenants who take care of a home and they will keep it as well as it's meant to be. But there are also situations where the tenant would just damage the property. I had a client who had a very, very hard situation with a tenant. The tenant, I think they just had anger issues and they'll punch holes in the wall. And he didn't know for a while. So if you're thinking to sell such a property, you need to know the condition of the property. You have to go there for an inspection, and you have to make notes of things that could be done to improve the property. Things that you could easily do, for example, if there's any leaking taps or any like plumbing work that could be done, those are things that you could get it done right away. Because if people come into a house and they see evidence of water is such a negative thing in a property that a lot of people would just mentally reduce the value of the home without even considering what the problem is. So there's minor things that you can do. Obviously, the tenant still lives there, so you cannot do major renovations, but for sure you can do minor things like painting or curb appeal or exterior look. So these are things that you can start to do to increase the value of the property. Another thing that for sure you should consider is to inform the tenants about your plans to sell. The reason I like to do this is because that this opens conversation. In most cases also, I've seen a situation where the tenant will just decide that they want to buy it. And if the tenant is willing to buy it, I always advise work with a real estate agent, because a lot of the times people don't know the value of their home. They don't even know how much it's gone up. For example, if you bought a property last year, this year alone, property values have gone up 35% in some cities. Here in Guelph, Kitchener-Waterloo, properties have gone up about 30%. So if, let's say, you were just assuming that the property, for example, single family detached homes right now, on average, it's 850. A lot of people don't know that. So before you sell your property off market in this situation to a tenant, make sure that you work with a real estate agent who can confirm the value of the home. Because as an investor, your goal is to always sell for top dollar and not to give away your property when you could have sold for more on market, or if you worked with a professional. Another thing is I always recommend to my clients is, yes, it's good to make repairs, but make sure that the repairs you're making have the highest return on investment. When we're thinking to go to market, we always think about what can I do that will give me the highest return on my investment. I have a list of repairs that will give you the highest return on investment. So if anybody is thinking to do some repairs to their property, please let me know and I'm willing to share that with you. Just to give you a few, painting is always a good idea because if you spend $5,000 on paint for a property, that will come back with 100% return. So that means your return on investment is going to be about 100%. So you get another 10,000 for the property versus if you didn't paint it on average. Painting is one. Cleaning, that's another thing that I always do. I know it's not a repair, but it goes with repairs. Every time I list an investment property, I always get a professional cleaner to just go through, scrub everything, clean the windows. That way the property shows better. When it comes to staging, if the property is vacant, I do stage it. But if the property is tenanted, you're limited as to whether or not you can stage it because you cannot instruct anyone to live a certain way. So you can't tell a tenant to live a certain way. You cannot impose on them how to live their lifestyle. So because of that, unless the tenant agrees with me that they would like to see some staging in the house, I usually don't do it. Another reason why I don't stage tenanted properties is because of liability. If you stage a property and something is damaged, who's going to pay for it? So because of reasons like that, I just stay away from staging. But for sure, what I will do is I do a professional cleaning and I work with the tenant to make sure that the situation works out for them as well. So if there's any questions right now, I'm just going to dive into the questions. This is my contact information. If anybody was looking to connect with us, we have a social media presence. On Instagram, it's at Investing in Waterloo. On Facebook, I believe it's at Joseline Nicholas. This is our website, and that's my email for those who are looking to connect with me. I'm just going to use this time to answer some of the questions that we have here. Sorry about that. Okay, so here are some questions. So if buyer signs an affidavit and later rent out the property, then how much time the tenant has to sue the buyer? So basically, the way I understand this question is if the tenant moves out only to find out that the property was rented out, how much time do they have before they can sue the buyer? So I don't know I don't know if there's a time limit, but I know for sure that if you say you're going to move into the property, you have to live into the property for at least 1 year before you can decide to rent it out. So I don't know if there's a time limit as to how long you have to wait. I'll connect with a lawyer and see if there's a time limit as to when the tenant has to sue. But I know for sure that the buyer has to live in the property for at least 1 year before they decide to rent it out. So I'll find out and get back to you. Another question is if the buyer wants vacant possession because they want to move in, but the tenants are still within their lease period, can the seller ask them to leave? No. If there's a lease in place, you have to wait until the lease is up. So if there's a lease in place, you have to wait until the lease is up, and because the tenant has the right to occupy the space as long as there's a lease in place. So the buyer has to wait until the lease is up for them to move in. Yes, somebody I think is just making a comment that 50% of your appreciation, so whatever the market value was minus your expenses, is taxed at a marginal tax rate, which means it's added to your income. So if you, for example, didn't make any income, it means it's taxed at the minimum marginal rate. But if you, in this case, as I was just telling you, I can't sell my property this year because my income is already high. If I sell it, it's going to be taxed at a much higher rate, which means that I will pay more taxes than if I sold it in a year where I made less. But if anybody has any questions about accounting related and capital gain questions, let me know. I'll bring in an accountant who can speak to these questions. Now I will just take a few minutes to answer some of the questions that were submitted ahead of time. I will try to get through all of them. If I can't get through any of these questions, I will call you and answer them specifically. So there's a question about increasing rents every year. If you have a tenanted property, make sure you increase the rents every year according to the legal rate that is set by the Landlord and Tenant Board, the Ontario government. Make sure that you're always increasing your rents. A lot of the times I see properties that were rented, for example, in 2014, and it's a 3-bedroom property and someone is still paying like $1,000. That's because you haven't been increasing your rents. If you don't increase your rents over time, and you come to the time of selling and you want to sell to an investor, investors are always looking at the bottom line, the numbers. So if your rents are really low, that will impact the price that you can sell your property for. So make sure that you're always increasing your rents, even when you don't intend on selling. I believe on average, the increase is about 2% every year on average. This year, I think it was much less. I think actually this year we're not even allowed to raise it because of COVID. So this year of COVID, we didn't raise our rent, but I believe as soon as we're allowed to start increasing the rent again, we'll start doing so. I just signed a 12-month lease a few months ago. Can I sell the property? Yes, you can sell the property. However, the buyer will not be able to move in until that lease is over. You can sell the property to a seller to a buyer who is an investor. Because the property was, the lease was signed 12 months ago, no, a few months ago, I would like to believe that you probably rented at market rent, so you'll be appealing to an investor. However, the right answer there is yes, you can sell it, but no one can move in unless the lease is up and the tenant is given proper notice to move out. Can I take photos of a property for marketing purposes? Yes, you can take pictures of the property. You just have to work with the tenants to make sure that you have 24-hour notice for the photographer to get through. Usually, because I know I cannot impose staging on the tenants, I'll just ask them to put away their belongings, things like family photos or degrees, things that will reveal their names and who they are, their valuables. I'll just ask them to pack these things, put them away. If possible, keep the space clean, and then a photographer will come in, take pictures. If they have pets, obviously like dogs, put them in their cages until the photographer is gone. And as I said earlier, cooperation is everything. One of my tricks, I'll give you a trick for when I'm selling my own properties that I own. I usually actually give tenants a break on rent. I give them like 50% less. So if they're paying $2,000, I'll tell them to pay $1,000. And I know that this $1,000 that I'm missing out on rent will bring me more in return because I will have more flex. Usually when I do that, when I give them a break, it's in exchange with them cooperating. So they cooperate with me selling the property, and in return, they pay less. So usually I have them pay the rent and I give them a credit of 1,000. And every time I've done this, it works out very, very well because they're happy. And I usually tell them that if you cooperate with me, I only need about a week or two, especially with the way the market has been. You can sell a property within 2 weeks, 1 week to prepare and go to market, and 1 week for the property to be on market. Nowadays, the average days on market is like 7 days. So I will tell them I only need 2 weeks. If you can cooperate with me, allow showings without 24-hour notice, because these things are all agreed upon. If they agree that if they allow me to go in the property without the 24-hour notice, I usually just make sure that both parties are happy, and I have a signed agreement with them that they'll cooperate with me to show the property for two weeks without notice, and they'll keep the property clean. In return, I'll give them a credit of $1,000 or 50% of their rent. That always works magic because it takes away all the red tape of selling an investment property. The next question is, I want to do some renovations before selling my property. Can I evict the tenant? No, you cannot evict the tenant because you want to do renovations to sell the property. There's a lot of talks about renovations. That is a whole different topic. That is if you want to do like major renovations such that nobody can live there while you're doing. Like, I feel like that's a whole different topic. But if you want to do minor things like painting and cleaning around, you cannot evict the tenant simply because you want to sell the property. You have to wait until the tenant moves out, or you have to just do things that you can do while the tenant is there. Can I pretend I'm moving into the unit myself in order to evict the tenant and then put it for sale? No, you can't do that. You cannot pretend that you're moving in. You have to live in the property for at least a year before Like if you're proven to have evicted a tenant in bad faith, you end up paying a fine. So don't do it. My tenant doesn't want showings before 11 a.m. or after 6 p.m. What should I do? So by law, the tenant is obligated to allow showings from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. I've had tenants, even myself, I've had tenants who say, I wake up late or I work night shift. For me, I always cooperate with them because I want them to be happy so we can go through the property. I know legally I can say, I don't care about your lifestyle. I want to show the property so I can sell it. I could do that. But I find that that approach always backfires because I believe in operating from a corporation perspective, like where I work with them so they can work with me. I had a tenant who said, you know what, I can't do showings from Monday to, let's say, Friday because I have an operation at the hospital and I just want to be left alone. I can't, I can't be away where people come to see the property. I understand that. So I said, okay, let's make a plan. Maybe I'll try to show it to as many people as possible before this day. If you allow me, so in that case, I'll just say, okay, would you allow me to show properties without 24-hour notice? If you allow me, then I have this timeline. We can go through the property. Maybe you can go away if you have a place. It's all negotiating. You basically just negotiate with them, find the middle ground, make sure that everybody is happy. I find that that approach always wins 100%. And for me, when I sell a tenanted property, I always remember to give the tenant a little something, like a small gift that says, a gift card, even if it's a gift card from Tim Hortons or Starbucks, just to appreciate the cooperation. Because I feel like when you work together with them like that, it just makes everything easier. And they keep the property clean, and no one's calling me at midnight because something happened, somebody's unhappy. I just find that when you work with people like that, everything works out the best. How do I evict my tenant so I can sell my property? You cannot evict the tenant to sell the property. You have to basically, instead of maybe evicting them, talk to them and see if they're willing to sign a mutually agreed upon agreement that to end the lease, which is the N11. I think I have one more question here. We have a tenanted property since we bought it. I understand that there will be a capital gain of 50%, which will be taxed. What are the tax implications for the property owners? There are currently 3 names on title, 2 are working, 1 is recently retired. How's the tax calculated for each individual? I hope you get a chance to answer my question. So this is a capital gain question again. From my experience, this is how it's been done in the past. And again, as I said, with capital gains question, I need to bring in an accountant who can speak to this topic. But from my experience in the past, it depends on ownership. What kind of ownership do you have? And what percentage do you own? If for example, every partner owns 33%, it means that 33% of the return will go to each individual, and 50% of that 33% will be taxable, and will be taxable at that rate. For example, for the individual who's retired, let's assume that they have no income. That means that the 50% of the 33% will become the taxable income. Now, this is so complicated for me to explain. I'm pretty sure that an accountant who explains these things on a daily basis will have a better way to explain it. So what I'll do is I'll connect with you one-on-one, and I'll get that question answered. And but I think another thing also is the best way to know what your tax implication will be is to speak to your own accountant. I always recommend have a professional. If I had to choose one, especially being a business owner, like I believe that if every single one of my properties is a business. So being a business owner, if I had to choose one profession that I can pay the highest amount, is the accountant, because everything you pay to the accountant comes back in multitude. If you book a 1-hour consultation, I know with my accountant, 1-hour consultation is like $1,000. If I pay this guy $1,000, I know I'm gonna get more out of that meeting because he's gonna talk to me about things that I didn't even know exist, ways I can strategize my investments, make better decisions such that I'm minimizing my tax obligation legally. So the best way I can answer this question is speak to your accountant. If you have a really good one, they will save you a lot of money. Sometimes when I look at how much the accountant saves me, I don't even complain about the $1,000 that I pay to meet with them for 1 hour. It's worth it. Can I refuse to sell my property as a seller after having a selling agreement signed with the buyer? If yes, what are the consequences? So after you sell your property, you have a mutually binding agreement of purchase and sell. So once you agree that you're selling your property, you cannot change your mind, especially if the sale is firm. If the sale is firm, which means unconditional, you cannot change your mind. Now, if you decide to change your mind, which has happened to me before, as a realtor, one of the sellers decided to change their mind after they had seen how much the property has gone up. Now that becomes a legal matter where the buyer can go to court and sue you, and it just becomes a legal fight, right? But this agreement of purchase and sale is mutually binding, which means the buyer cannot walk away, the seller cannot walk away unless it was conditional. If it's firm, you can't walk away, you can't change your mind. And if you do, it becomes a legal battle. Okay, let's see if there's any other questions. Do you have any accountant you recommend for real estate investors? Yes, I have a few that I can recommend. I have my top 2 that I have used in the past. So maybe I'll connect with you and give you the names. The reason I want to give you 2 is because sometimes people live in different locations, but I have 2 names of like amazing accountants that I can recommend. So I'll connect with you and give you that name tomorrow. If you can't evict, but you can give 60 days notice on month-to-month basis. You can't evict. Yes, that's correct. So you cannot evict them, but you can give 60 days notice if the tenant is on a month-to-month basis. Okay, I think we've answered all the questions. Is this being recorded? Yes, it is being recorded, and the recording will be available at the beginning of next week. I'm probably going to say Monday or Tuesday. The recording will be available. So we will send it to everyone. And if there's any questions, feel free to reach out to our team. We're always here for our clients and those who follow us, and anybody really, investors who would like advice, please feel free to reach out. Another thing that I really help people with, if you're looking to grow your portfolio, that's something that we can talk about as well. I find that sometimes people are looking to maybe buy more properties. If that is you and you're thinking to scale and grow your portfolio, that is something that I am able to help with as well. And as I said, one of my magic powers is finding those off-market deals. So do connect with me if you have any of these needs, and I'll be happy to help. So I've answered all the questions. I'm just going to say thank you very much for tuning into this webinar. And if you have any questions, as I said, feel free to connect with my team. Once again, my name is Joseline Nicholas, and we'll connect with you soon.